that Tim was about to talk to you about is that we have a long history together. We go back to before even 2005, but we were both in New Orleans in 2005 when Hurricane Katrina hit. I was a newly tenured faculty at Tulane, and he was an aspiring grad student at that time. And after the catastrophe, we decided to team up with some other folks and begin to survey different neighborhoods in the city to see about the recovery, and in particular, how social inequalities influence those recoveries. And this is a picture behind me of us back in New Orleans just a few years ago, I think 2013. Tim was bringing down some students from Mount Royal to learn about disaster recovery, but also to help rebuild. So some of his students here are working to rebuild a house near the city's 9th Ward. And as you can see, Tim and I are pretty much just standing around, not doing much. But I like the hard hats. I think they look good. So I tried to keep it. They wouldn't let us keep it, but that's sort of the history of Tim and I, and we're continuing that history together, and I love it. It's great. One of the things that, for many people, New Orleans' 9th Ward began to symbolize is two really strong global trends of our age. I think they're defining trends in many respects. And one of those we've heard about before, or earlier today, which is the rising costs of natural hazards and disasters. And these are just two books. So one of those is written on there, and the other trend is rising social inequality, in particular social inequalities of wealth. And so on the right here is a book that was recently published by Thomas Shapiro on toxic inequality. And that's the term he uses to describe inequalities in wealth, because they're so important. They're related to where we all live, and they're equally important for how families and communities are going to do in the future. Those are the resources they have. So what we want to think about is how they're related. And for sociologists of disaster and the environment and sort of urban spaces, a common argument and lesson we try to invoke, and you've heard some of that today already, is that natural disasters and hazards tend to reveal or expose existing inequalities in our society. And that was certainly true in New Orleans when Katrina hit. Suddenly, across the world, people saw images and video of these deep divides, some people stuck on roofs and without resources. And those were emblematic of inequalities in New Orleans that had been long in place, but now they were revealed and exposed. What I want to do with you today is see if we want to take this idea a step further and begin to explore the hypothesis or the possibility that disasters in our age are not just revealing social inequalities, but actually contributing to them and helping to cause them. So what I want to do today is share some research that I've been doing with another colleague, Junia Howe at the University of Pittsburgh. And to begin thinking about this possibility or this hypothesis, at least in the US, it's important to begin to realize how it is that societies experience and respond to natural hazards and disasters. And there are really two main ways. One is the experience. We heard earlier, and this is the good news, that mortality related to disasters and hazards has been going steadily down over time. On the other hand, the costs of these natural hazards and disasters have been going up. And what we see is that there are two general ways that society responds to those rising costs. And I think it may be a little bit more true in the US, but I think it's also true in Canada from what I've heard talking with some of the folks here. And the two ways that people respond or society responds is, first, there's public or government aid. So in the US, that comes through the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA. So that's one main way that property is restored. Another way is through private insurance markets. So these are data just from 2015, and we see those two sources alone, just for that year, came to over $30 billion. And that's a conservative estimate. And the primary purpose of both of these response systems is, in effect, to restore property, fixed wealth. The restoration and the well-being of communities and families and people is presumed to come from that restoration of property. Get the property up, it restored, then well-being will follow. But we need to think a little bit more about how that might happen and whether or not how we devise this system might be generating inequality. And to do that, I would argue that the next step we have to take is to think about disasters as being the tip of the iceberg. That they're important to study, and I'm glad we're doing lots of research and we have research centers on disasters, but I think it's equally important to think about them as part of a subset of a much larger phenomenon of natural hazards, and particularly natural hazards that damage property. So I'll give you an example. 3 years ago, my wife and I moved to Houston, Texas, where I became a professor at Rice University. In just the 3 years we've been there, there have been 21 tornadoes, floods, and storms that have caused significant hazard damage. And you thought it was only the politics that were scary in Texas. It turns out nature is too, and they work in concert. But one of the things that happens, though, is only 2 of those were declared disasters, because that becomes a political process. At least in the US, to become declared a disaster, you have to meet a certain threshold. You have to overwhelm local and state responses or resources. So in Texas, that requires some event to destroy or damage at least $20 to $30 million, depending on the circumstances, before it counts. So there are a lot more storms and events, the 19 that I mentioned that didn't get declared, that actually cause a lot of damage, but don't declare disasters. But for a lot of low-income people who don't have resources, who don't have savings, if they're disrupted by those smaller events, that can be disastrous to them. So we need to think about disaster for whom when we're thinking about this. So let's just put some numbers on this nationally. In the US in 2015, the latest year of available data, there were 42 declared disasters. I mean, even that's remarkable. That's 3 to 4 declared disasters a month. And they caused about $1 billion or a little more than $1 billion in direct damages. Payouts were a lot more than that, but that's direct damage to property, and it's a conservative estimate. But when we look at the hazards for that year through other databases, we find that there are actually many hundreds of more hazards that caused significant damage to property. And they cause billions of more damage. And this happens every year. As pointed out by Glenn's talk earlier, these things accumulate. So next we need to think about what is in store for the future. So in the US, we have data going back to the 1960s on natural hazard damages to property. And if you do the averaging across 1960 to the present, that's about $7 to $8 billion in real dollars. That is adjusted for inflation every single year. Now, when the scientists go out and begin to project out into the future, and not that far out into the future, just 2050, and they do some conservative estimates. They say, what if we allow for better building codes and some better design features? What are we likely to see in 2050 based on what we know about current trends? And the low to moderate estimate is that the damages by 2050 will double to quadruple in real dollars. This is after contributing or accounting for inflation. So that's disconcerting. So as we think about this, you might say, oh, okay, well, that's probably just around the coastal areas or in certain areas, certain cities. And so maybe we should focus our efforts there in trying to answer this question about hazards and inequality. But when we go to the map, and we can do this with data for 5 years only. So these are data from 2010 to 2015. And what they show are counties in the US where damage has occurred. So the dark icons are the declared disasters. They met the threshold, and we see that they're there, but they're not the only thing that's there. Everything that's not gray on that map, which is pretty much everywhere, is a place that had significant hazard damage that didn't reach that local disaster threshold. And the darker the yellow and the orange and the red, the more hazards actually happen. So the norm isn't just that natural hazards occur. It might vary. You know, some places it might be a tornado, other places it's a flood, other places it's a winter storm. But somewhere it's all happening, or everywhere it's all happening. And it's happening repeatedly. More and more happening repeatedly in the same place. So how do we want to think about this? Let's go back to the hypothesis of the question. Does rising hazard damage actually contribute to or potentially cause rising social inequality? So one way to do this is actually to turn the analyses around, not start with the disaster, as important and spectacular as they are, but instead start with a random sample of people. Since these things are hitting everywhere, let's go out and see if we can survey not just green bug people, but real people about what's happening where they live as they experience these repeated hazards, as the hazard damages add up over time where they live. And that's a tall order, that's expensive. There's a reason why we don't do that very often. But in the US, we're fortunate to have this longitudinal study that's been running for quite some time, and it randomly sampled thousands of people in the 1960s and followed them and their families and added more people along the way. And it's a representative sample that gets interviewed every 2 years on a lot of different questions. I don't think I have the patience to be in that survey, but I'm very glad that people do, and I hope they get food and booze like we do to listen to the results. But what happens is from this survey, we can devise some data. So the data I'm going to show you today, or the analyses, are going to come from 1999 to 2013. So these are actual data. And we can start with the questions that respondents are asked about their assets. So they have to endure a battery of questions. How much money do you have in your savings? How much do you have in your retirement accounts? How much equity would you say you have in your home? How much other rental property, other sort of assets do you have? And every 2 years when they're asked these questions, we can add that up and say, okay, that's your total sort of family or individual wealth, depending on the situation. We also know where they live, so we can put them in a county, and then we can match those data to the hazard data. How much direct property damage did you experience in the county where you lived? And we can also look at the amount of FEMA assistance that you got to that county. So that's great. And even if someone moves, the survey follows them. So they get moved to another county, we just start putting the data from that county. We also have information on how much money they spend on insurance, say for their home and for their automobile. So we can control for that statistically and look at a lot of other things that this survey has that you probably don't want to hear about. But we can look at their age, their race, their family status, all sorts of things. In addition to their neighborhood quality, we can locate them there and begin to control for that. So the question we're back to is, will these data help us understand that hypothesis or assess the hypothesis of generating inequality? And there are a lot of different ways we could go about this, but what I want to do is keep it fairly straightforward. There are a lot of modeling issues behind this. We've done a lot of the hard work, but we're going to keep it simple or easy today, and we're going to focus on two very different types of people. And one of those types of people is a white, educated college person, such as I was in New Orleans when Katrina hit. We're going to compare that person's wealth trajectory over time with someone who's less privileged, an African-American renter without a whole lot of education. That was my neighbor across the street when Katrina hit. So we can start statistically with 2 points. We can start where there's a county where there's absolutely no damage during this 1999 to 2013 span. We now know that that's completely a utopian vision. That rarely happens. But that scenario has our wealth gap at about $60,000. And again, we're controlling for, and this is a little utopian, we're paying in the same amount of insurance. Statistically, we have the same age and family structure. What happens when more damage happens over this period for the more privileged resident? What we see is that their wealth actually goes up. That if you're a privileged person in the United States anyway, the more damage your area receives, the more wealth you're actually going to make. This is pretty stunning to me. What happens to the less privileged individual? The opposite happens. They begin to lose wealth as damages accrue locally. So why is this the case? For now, with these data, we can't answer the why very well, but we can bring in other literature, and it seems to suggest the following. I know that when I was at Tulane, I had more secure employment and housing than my neighbor across the street. When we were displaced, and I was displaced and not teaching, I even got a direct deposit from my employer. My house was still there when I got the insurance payment. I had to fix the roof and do things, but I got more money than it actually cost. So I actually benefited in a way from this because I was able to be secure. My neighbor, by contrast, did not have secure employment, fell on unemployment, lost wages, had to dip into savings, and also then had to move. And so probably lost his security deposit from his former landlord, so he doesn't get that money back. Then in going to rent, he has to put first and last month's deposit somewhere, put that in, had to dip into savings, and then there was just a series of things that got harder and harder for him to make ends meet. And so we had this divergence. Now the next and final question is whether or not FEMA is going to help. If you bring in government insurance, will that help keep this polarization from happening quite as dramatically? And we can look at that question in a similar manner. We can take the same two types of people and we can say, okay, we're going to subject them to the same level of natural hazard damage. All that's going to differ on the x-axis here is how much money comes in to that county to help resource recovery. So at the left end, what we have is a scenario in which no FEMA money comes in. There are lots of small disasters that add up, but they don't declare disasters, so no FEMA money. Now we can increase the FEMA assistance. And what we see is the same upward trajectory for the privileged and the same downward for the less privileged residents. So this is happening above and beyond the effects of hazard damage themselves. So this is actually exacerbating the inequality that's being generated through these processes. So to conclude, I think there's evidence, although this is new and we're still processing it, there's evidence that in fact rising natural hazard costs and disaster costs are in fact contributing to disasters. And there are a number of reasons to be concerned about this, but I've suggested three in particular today. One is that these things are happening everywhere, not just where there are disasters, and you only need a small effect to affect people with not a whole lot of resources. Second, the projections are that these damages and impacts will increase over the coming decades. And third, at least in the US, the way we develop and deploy federal assistance actually exacerbates the problem. That's the bad news. The good news is that these things are actually, it seems to me anyway, connected. So we can feed two birds with one hand. On the one hand, we can develop better strategies for recovering areas after natural hazards and natural disasters. And in the process, as we think about how to do that better and more justly, we can actually reduce wealth inequality. And in the process, we can develop and nurture and encourage more resilient, more just communities as we continue to face natural hazards in the future. Thank you.